things are bad now, but they may seem worse than they are because the period leading up to the 90s were just so depolarized that America was maybe at a weird point in its history that America before the New Deal was fairly polarized, and then there was 30 or 40 years of depolarization where things were pretty centrist, and you had liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats, and you don't really see that anymore.
Tonight, we're looking at the role of media and perception in political polarization, the history of partisanship, and what we can do to move forward to bridge the partisan divide. Now, I'd like to introduce tonight's panel. Shanto Iyengar is a professor of political science and director of the Political Communication Laboratory at Stanford University. Iyengar's areas of expertise include the role of mass media in democratic societies, public opinion, and political psychology. Iyengar is author or co-author of several books, including News That Matters, Explorations in Political Psychology, and Media Politics, A Citizen's Guide. Also, Joanne Levine is executive producer of multimedia for CQ Roll Call in Washington, D.C. She has spent her professional life traveling the globe to better understand the world and explain it to others. As a journalist, she helped to launch Al Jazeera English in the U.S. as its founding head of programming for North and South America, where she was responsible for all documentary and current affairs output from those regions. Previously, Levine was an award-winning producer for ABC News Nightline with Ted Koppel and ABC World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. You may have heard of those two gentlemen. Levine was also a senior advisor for media at the State Department, where she worked on freedom of expression, human rights, and gender, among other issues. And last but not least, Yif Lelkesh is an assistant professor at the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. His main focus is on the role of the political information environment in structuring attitudes, with a special interest in the proliferation of digital media, that is, and he will explain to you what that is. He has written on effective polarization, or the increasing hostility between Democrats and Republicans, and ways in which the media has contributed to inter-party animosity. His research has appeared or is forthcoming in various journals across disciplines, including the American Journal of Political Science, Political Psychology, and the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology. And our moderator for tonight is Laura Colarusso, the digital managing editor at GBH News and a darn fine colleague. In her role, Laura oversees the newsroom's digital strategy, coordinates breaking news coverage, and edits everything from feature stories to video packages. She is also the author of The Thread, a weekly newsletter that comes from the heart of our newsroom. You can sign up for that. You'll see a note on the chat. Prior to joining GBH News, Laura was a member of the Boston Globe's editorial board and a reporter at Newsweek, where she covered immigration and campaign finance. She began her career in Washington, D.C., covering the Pentagon and Congress for a variety of publications. I will stop talking now and welcome Laura Colarusso and our distinguished panel to the screen.
Thanks, Aaron, and thank you to the panelists for being here tonight. I want to start this evening by acknowledging that we are about 2 weeks away from what most people, no matter where you sit on the political spectrum, are describing as the most important election of our lifetimes. Yet we see the race quite differently. On one hand, many President Trump supporters believe that if Joe Biden wins the White House, he would usher in a socialist government designed to destroy the right to self-determination. And on the other side, Joe Biden advocates are sounding the alarm that another 4 years of this administration would mean the end of the rule of law and democracy in the United States as we know it. These descriptions may seem like caricatures, again, depending on your political point of view, but this election cycle has been fraught with conflict, and at times it's felt dangerous. Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer was almost kidnapped. Civil unrest and tensions have escalated between protesters and law enforcement. And not too long ago, FBI Director Christopher Wray recently testified before Congress that the threat posed by white supremacists and what he described as racially motivated violent extremism is on the march. The discordant nature of our politics isn't a new phenomenon, but it feels as though these divisions along racial, class, geographic, and political lines have deepened. Polling data and other studies show that even if there is broad agreement on certain policies, Americans perceive themselves to be more polarized. All you have to do is look at how Democrats and Republicans rate President Trump's job performance. That contrast is very stark. As the New York Times columnist Tom Edsall wrote more than 2 years ago, quote, hostility to the opposition party and its candidates has now reached a level where loathing motivates voters more than loyalty. The building strength of this partisan antipathy has radically altered politics. Anger has become the primary motivating tool for voters. Since then, the rhetoric pushing us into our respective corners has only grown louder. So tonight, we're going to examine the factors underlying this polarization in America. We'll consider how politicians exploit this, and then talk about a few ways we might break out of the bubbles that we're in. We hope that by fostering more understanding about polarization, we can provide critical insights that will encourage people to find ways in their own neighborhoods, perhaps even within their own families, to bridge the divide. So with that, I'd like to pose a question to the entire panel. If you were to try to explain political polarization in the United States today, how would you describe it? Shanto, let's start with you.
Well, the conventional definition of polarization in the social sciences has typically been along the lines of ideological extremism. And that is to say that you have one party that is on the left to the extreme, a liberal socialist party perhaps, and another party that's on the right, a conservative party. That's the classical definition. More recently, however, as you referenced in Tom Edsall's New York Times column, the definition has shifted to one that is based on sentiment. How do supporters of a particular party evaluate and feel towards themselves, their own party, and their opponents? Of course, in the United States, we have a two-party system, so it's fairly clear-cut. And that work has shown in the last 30 years a rather alarming increase in the expression of out-party animus, where Democrats evaluate Republicans as being untrustworthy, not looking out for the interests of the nation. And in general, you have the sort of expression of unfavorable traits being attributed to the opposing party.
Yif, let's get you in here. What's your answer to that question?
I think Shanto did a good job in describing what I think are, at least at the level of the regular person, the regular Joe or Jane, kind of what polarization is. It's really out party animus, in party love. So generally political scientists will talk about polarization at two different levels. And that's what we see at the mass level, this increasing hostility towards the other side. But it's important to note that also at the elite level, the level of political activists or members of Congress, there is real substantive disagreement now, much more than there was in the past.
I was going to say, I feel as if I should not be answering this question as a journalist as to what is polarization. If you want to ask it in terms of media, I can certainly talk about that. And I can say that, you know, the media, and I use the word specifically and not journalism, but the media has definitely reflected society over the last 20 or 30 years and become more splintered, more polarized, just more in general.
Back to Shanto for a moment. I wanted to ask, I think it's important to define this to begin with, and get a sense for how we even can measure polarization. What are you looking for when you study this, and how do you quantify it?
Well, it's generally a matter of attitudes, and so we typically quantify it through surveys or polls, and we have good polling data on evaluations of both the political parties going all the way back to the early 1970s. So the same question has been asked repeatedly, in which individuals rate the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, supporters of each of the parties. And we can track that over time, and what those time trends reveal is that your feelings towards your own party, that is to say, in-party favoritism, has remained very stable. People like their own party, and that's pretty much a constant. What has changed is their feeling toward their opponents. So beginning around 1980 or 1984, in these election year surveys, you begin to see a very steady increase in the level of hostility toward the political opposition. So that's the main survey evidence showing the fact that the polarization has increased in this country over the last 30 years.
Right. And do you see in the data much switching between parties, or are people pretty much signed up for one side and they stay there?
Oh no, the evidence on party identification in the United States is unequivocal on that point. It's acquired at a very early stage in life, and it stays stable thereafter. There's very little flipping.
And I think we had a discussion a few days ago about how politics have become so much more personal. And a lot of this is about the way that we sort ourselves into different groups. So I was hoping you could give the audience a little bit, at first I'd like to define what sorting is and give people a sense for how that's intensified over the last several decades.
Well, I mean, sorting is a complicated term, but one way we can think about sorting is to look at the correspondence between the political divide, Democrat versus Republican, and other prominent social and economic divides that characterize American society. So you can look, for instance, at the race cleavage. And you notice that over time, the race cleavage and the party cleavage have become more and more correlated. They're now in complete alignment. The Democratic Party is the party of racial minorities. The Republican Party is pretty much the party of white America. You can do the same thing with gender, and you see a parallel sort of increasing alignment between the gender cleavage and the party cleavage, and so on and so forth. You can talk about place of residence, you can talk about religion, you can talk about region, socioeconomic status. So sorting essentially means that the notion of the outgroup is no longer defined exclusively in terms of party, but it's now a concatenation of outgroups, including gender, race, age, place of residence, and what have you.
And Yef, I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of this. Is there a historical analog to the amount of polarization we're seeing today in the United States? How has that polarization sort of tracked over time?
I think, let me first start by saying things might seem, things are bad now, but they may seem worse than they are because the period leading up to the 90s were just so depolarized that America was maybe at a weird point in its history that America before the New Deal was fairly polarized, and then there was 30 or 40 years of depolarization where things were pretty centrist, and you had liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats, and you don't really see that anymore. So if you just kind of compare now to period 30 years ago, it may make the situation seem more extreme than it has been historically in the US. And that's not necessarily saying that it's in a good place. It's just that the period of depolarization or moderation was a weird one in American history. And I guess the point you're asking of, is there a historical analog? I think the one possible, so of course you can look back in the United States and again see that the US has been polarized many times in history. And if you look at the data on Congress, you see that we're about as polarized as we were around the Civil War. Another analog, I think, is Germany before the rise of the Nazis, or Britain in the end of the 19th century. And here I'm drawing on Daniel Ziblatt's work, who is a professor at a small college in Cambridge, local college. I think they're comparable because in both these periods there were kind of a rise for democratic reforms that threatened the political and economic power of the ruling right, the rich on the right. And what we see is kind of a situation that's similar as it's going on right now, is that when there was threats to the power of the ruling class, in both countries they had an option. They could either moderate and kind of redistribute some wealth and give more power to the public, or what they could do, as what happened in Germany, is form a coalition with the radical right and become more extreme. And you kind of see that now among the Republican Party, where there are demographic shifts and other shifts that are threatening kind of the economic status quo, and the Republican Party is responding in kind by forming a coalition with more extreme elements.
That's interesting. I wanted to follow up quickly on this idea that, we're about as polarized today as we were around the Civil War. Did I hear that correctly?
According to some data, yeah.
Are there factors you could pull out, parallels that kind of explain why both moments would be so particularly polarized?
In kind of the running theme in American history is always race, and race was obviously the dividing line then, and again it's the dividing line today, and with some degree that that the parties are really sorted on race, where you have a fairly homogenous Republican Party and a more diverse Democratic Party. And according to some, that's what is driving us apart, kind of, again, the racial dividing lines in these countries.
Joanne, I think it's safe to say that there are a number of forces sort of buffeting the journalism industry right now. And a lot of them have to do with sort of consolidation, corporatization, and the shrinking of the news cycle. And I think a lot of these factors probably play into some of what we're talking about now, but I wanted to get a sense for, over the course of your career, how you've seen news organizations deal with this and how it's sort of played into issues of polarization.
I'll try and break it down a little bit, but I would say in my 30 years or so in newsrooms, I would say when we talk about journalism, the journalists and news organizations reflect what's going on in society, or try to. So a lot of some of what you're hearing and sort of the shrieking and the noise that's out there within journalism is a reflection of what's going on in society. So I'll start there. But if you go back 30 years ago, it was still a moment where you had the three main networks. You had majority of Americans, it wasn't quite the 60s, but you still had a good part of the country listening to three main voices. You certainly had, mainstream media, and it was before the advent really of the internet and before social media and everything that has come with the internet. So what you've seen in the last 30 years is the ability for both good and bad, right? For good and evil, in the sense of there are more voices than ever before. There are more outlets than ever before. But with that, at times, there's less responsible outlets popping up as well. And again, I make the distinction between media and journalism. Journalism, I think, most journalists do try and stay within a certain guidelines of fairness. I don't use the word objectivity because I think there is no such thing as objectivity. Everyone brings in what they know and what they have. So the most that they can do is be fair. But anyway, over the last 30 years, the advent of cable news, the advent of the fact that it's much cheaper to have a lot of talking heads out there rather than reported news stories. That takes resources, it takes time, and the economic pressure on the news industry has sort of dovetailed with this moment of what our other panelists are talking about and the polarization. And you sort of fast forward to today and you have a lot of programming on cable and other places where it's punditry, which is not reported out. Sometimes it's factual, but it also often bleeds into opinion. And because of the time today where it is a country so divided, you get a lot of yelling.
Do you think that, from the news consumer's point of view, it's harder to get to fact? There's so much noise out there in the system that it's just harder to get to fact?
I mean, I think there is. I mean, look, there you have Facebook, and when Facebook first came out, their whole premise is we're a platform. We're a mode of delivery. We're not media, and that was a way of sort of skirting the issues that all the networks have to abide by FCC guidelines. Facebook, Twitter, some of the other platforms don't, but they have evolved into, giant, this is my opinion, not CQ roll call, but they're media. I mean, they're more than just a platform, right? So to answer your question, simply yes.
Shanto, I wanted to get into a few specific examples of things that we've seen in the media lately, but also in 2016. Hillary Clinton's comment about the basket of deplorables, Donald Trump retweeting a video about how the only good Democrat is a dead Democrat. When the leaders of political parties do things like this or make statements like this, what effect does that have on people? Is there a psychology behind this that or political psychology behind this that makes it sort of supercharged?
Well, there is pretty good evidence that partisans tend to follow the lead of party leaders. So if party leaders are engaging in hate speech, that's going to encourage partisan animus among the rank and file. So if you look at the content of political advertising over the last 20 years, it's pretty clear the attack ad has emerged as the dominant strategy. So politicians are spending more time denigrating their opponents than they are promoting their own candidacies. So all of this has created a sort of an atmosphere of hatred and animosity, and in many ways, this sort of growth of negative sentiment towards the opposing party is really ordinary rank and file Democrats and Republicans simply regurgitating the rhetoric they're exposed to over the course of their news encounters and their exposure to political campaigns in particular.
I find this really fascinating. And Yef, I wanted to ask you because there are a lot of areas, a lot of policy areas where there's broad agreement in the U.S. I'm thinking about background checks for gun sales, even abortion to a certain extent. The majority of people, there is agreement there. So, why, if there is agreement on policy, why are we seemingly so divided politically?
In terms of agreement on policy, I think what you see is part of it is what Shanto brought up, this idea of sorting, that the average hasn't shifted. It's just that so Republicans and Democrats, the average Republican belief on abortion and the average Democratic belief on abortion hasn't shifted much. It's just the kind of the makeup of these two groups has shifted. So now what you see is, right. So what you see is just kind of movement of people where all Democrats now hold the same position and all Republicans hold the same position. They haven't become more extreme. So that's one reason why we haven't seen much shifting. Another reason why we seem so divided is that although the rank and file hasn't shifted their opinions much, political elites certainly have, and political activists and these people who are constantly on Twitter, they have shifted, and they are the loudest, and they get the most attention. So there's a perception that everything has changed on issues, and whether or not that's actually the case. So there's kind of this gap between perceived polarization and what people actually believe. And as Shanto said, the political elites are really who we're following and how we're deciding our opinions. So when we see this on Twitter, we're not necessarily, or on social media, we're not necessarily picking up on the substance of their comments, just the tone of their comments. So we become angrier, if not necessarily disagreeing more.
Thank you. Joanne, I wanted to go back to you to ask about partisan media. You started a little bit in your answer to get at this, but I was hoping that we could talk more about how partisan media has actually fueled this polarization, and actually how does the polarization, or how has the partisan media sort of changed the way audiences are expecting their news to be delivered?
Look, I think that something that Ip was saying about sort of the loudness, I've watched the progression of social media, in a sense, enter the newsrooms, right? I mean, and it started with, it really came to a head with this president who didn't issue releases, didn't give much press conferences in the beginning, and spoke informally to press gatherings, but his tool of choice for delivering a message was tweets. So in the newsroom, people would monitor what tweet was being said at what time. When I was doing a stint before CQ Roll Call at NPR, Weekend Edition, we would watch for tweets to come in at 5 o'clock in the morning to determine what was going to be the news story. And if you multiply that across every newsroom, and that's the pinnacle in terms of the president using tweets, but social media often drives the news agenda, depending on who is issuing the tweet, whether it's the president, whether it's policymakers, whether it's activists, but a tweet can decide the rhythm of the news cycle. So that's definitely having an impact. And in terms of I'm sorry, that was the main part of your question, yes?
Yes. Sorry again for the audio. Can everyone hear me? Great. So, because the next question, to follow up on that, I wanted to go back to Yif and ask about social media bubbles. We had a chance to discuss this a little while back, but I wanted to give the audience a sense for what's happening when we're on social media. Are we just reinforcing our bubbles, or are there other forces at play?
Sure. So there are currently two explanations for the role of social media and social media bubbles. There is this idea of echo chambers where we just follow people we agree with and ignore people we don't. And the notion, according to that theory, is that when you're in a bubble, you just hear the same idea over and over, or you just hear ideas that agree with you and you become more extreme. While there is some evidence for this, I think kind of the conventional wisdom is fairly overstated, that the people who live in echo chambers tend to already be extreme. So there's probably not going to be much effect on them because they've already selected into an echo chamber, and any additional information doesn't really shift their attitudes. However, there is another concern now with social media in that people who are not necessarily interested in politics are now exposed to really hostile information. So, people who aren't really that interested in politics, and unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, in America, that's most of us, but our opinions are much more malleable, let's say, that they're more sensitive to shifts. And now, let's say, we have all these ties on Facebook and social media, connections to people we wouldn't meet, you know, like I'm in Philadelphia, that I wouldn't necessarily meet on the street. And I may have, you know, a extremely conservative uncle or something like that, whose opinion I wouldn't necessarily hear, and now I'm inadvertently being exposed to it. Or for instance, let's say I have someone I know from high school who I didn't really like in high school, sharing things about politics. Well, because I already don't like them, anything they say is going to kind of transfer onto politics. So it'll drive me further away. So this is the idea of the inadvertent audience, which I think if social media has an effect, it's probably more due to kind of exposure to rhetoric you didn't want to hear than it is about echo chambers.
Makes sense. So I want to go back to Shanto because weaving in some of the social media issues here, because of social media, sometimes it does feel like we don't have a common set of facts to work off of. You know, I'm thinking about COVID and masks, whether or not masks help stop the spread of COVID, global warming, and whether or not people believe it. There are a lot of fights about that over social media. How do politicians exploit this polarized environment?
Well, it's ripe for disinformation campaigns. If people have this strong sense of commitment to their own point of view, it's almost a sort of a degree of party identification has morphed into a sense of tribalism. We have this very intense loyalty to our own group and this very strong hostility towards our opponents. We're more motivated, therefore, to believe in things that reinforce this worldview. And so Mr. Trump has made it sort of a staple of his discourse from day one. You know, his descriptions of immigrants, of Mexicans, his claim that millions of illegal votes were cast in 2016. There's very good survey data suggesting that large numbers of Republicans actually believe these claims. And the same partisan divide exists on things like practicing social distancing and wearing masks. So all of this is evidence of what we would call, you know, this motivated reasoning syndrome. We are acquiring factual beliefs that suit our point of view.
Great, thank you. And then just finally, before we get to some audience questions, I wanted to go back to Joanne, just to ask, what could consumers do? What could media organizations and consumers of news do to bridge this divide? In other words, what are their responsibilities here?
Well, I mean, I think that news organizations have a huge responsibility. You know, journalism is a public service. It's the fourth estate. It's about getting out facts and the truth. You know, the issue, and I think it really depends what people consume, what they read. There are all these programs now in schools from elementary on about news literacy, and, you know, how I think the hardest thing right now is for people to know what's true and what's not, right? Hopefully, if you're watching or listening to someone from you know, NPR, GBH, there's a sense of, okay, this is public media. It's been fact checked and what they're presenting is true. It gets trickier as you sort of go down the chain of different media, and, you know, there's been infiltration is too strong a word, but there are certainly many more points of view, and many media saying their news, whether it's QAnon or others. But I think that a lot of people who are journalists and news organizations would, you know, push back hard as to it's propaganda or it's a point of view. And I think that is a really big looming question over a lot of news organizations these days about how do we distinguish ourselves from all this noise that's out there on social media? How do we cut through? And I don't, you know, I wish I had an easy answer for you, but I don't.
Thanks, Joanne. Great. I want to go now to some audience questions. We actually have someone from Seattle who wrote in, which is very cool. Ralph Sheridan asks,
how do you recreate a Ronald Reagan, Tip O'Neill type partnership in today's environment? I'm wondering if he's wondering if that's possible.
Well, bipartisanship these days seems very hard to come by. The Reagan-O'Neill partnership was in the good old days when results seemed to matter. Today, working across the party divide is difficult because that might send a message to your key constituents that you're sort of, collaborating with the enemy, so to speak. So the intensity of partisan identity has really made this kind of collaboration just more difficult. It's, in a sense, by working across the party divide, you're almost sending a signal that you don't have any real loyalty to your group.
Yes, Christina Kulich in Boston asks, we've talked about a number of big drivers of polarization, but what have been some of the less obvious drivers of increasing polarization and dysfunction in Congress, both between the major parties and within each of their own caucuses?
That's a good question. We mostly focus on the big drivers. So some of one that people like to bring up is this notion that senators and members of Congress don't spend any time in Washington anymore, that they used to spend time together and develop friendships. And nowadays, as with permanent campaigning and a need to constantly generate money, that is happening less and less. And you even see that in this, there's a study where they looked and they took C-SPAN videos and looked at how much senators were crossing the aisle to go talk to another member of the Senate. And over time, that kind of actual physical crossing the aisle has gone down. So that's one possibility that people have talked about. Another driver of dysfunction, and I think this is actually a fairly major driver, is kind of the density gap, in that population density is now very strongly correlated with vote choice, where rural counties almost always go completely for the right, and urbans, especially places, go completely to the left. So this kind of place politics has been a huge driver in polarization.
Can I add something to that?
Please do.
So I watch Congress pretty closely, and I would say that when there is need for common ground, even in this moment of extreme polarization, members of Congress seem to be able to find it. It's interesting, there's a group of, for instance, women lawmakers, and they meet on a regular basis, and they're from both sides of the aisle. I think it's because they're probably both in the House and the Senate and in minority. So they talk and meet informally and talk on a regular basis, and that sort of goes against the norm, on sort of the big ticket items. I think that division, where it would be a public show of reaching a handout is much harder. But I do think you see it on some of the smaller, or let's just put it this way, issues that aren't, it's not a Supreme Court justice, but maybe it's about infrastructure. There is some reaching across the aisle. It's not covered, right? And that's I would say, I think CQ Roll Call, a little plug here, but they do cover the minutia of Congress, which is how I know about this group of women that meet, but you don't hear about that, right? In sort of mainstream. So there are what I would call threads of hope. They're fragile, but they are there.
Great, thank you. Frank D'Angelo and Revere had a question about free speech on college campuses and how at times it seems like certain speech is not allowed, and he was wondering about whether or not that adds to the divide. His specific question was, how can the divide be bridged if people are not allowed to talk on college campuses, if they get disinvited because people feel like the message that might be sent would be harmful? So actually, I would like to go to Shanto for that one.
Well, I mean, it's not so much that there is formal censorship. It's rather this idea of political correctness. And I think the conventional wisdom, and I would agree with that, is that most college campuses are to the left of center, and therefore speakers who are conservative or on the right are not welcome. And that is clearly, I think, an unhealthy state of affairs, and we'd be better off if there was a more sort of a welcoming environment in which people with very different views were not immediately stigmatized and dismissed as being not worthy of being listened to.
We have a couple of questions about religion, actually. One from our moderator, Aaron Schachter, and another from Jeannie Yarosh in Sandwich, Massachusetts, who are asking the panelists to comment on the role of faith and community in creating either actively or passively the partisan divide, and the opportunity and responsibility that these groups have to resolve it. Yif, did you want to tackle that one?
Well, you know, I'm not sure I can give a great response to that. One thing I can say is that there is kind of this funny relationship, I don't know if it's funny, between politics and religion in this country, where people, we would like to think, or you would think, that your religious views affect your political views. But what people have found is that sometimes your political views affect your religious views. So there's this reverse relationship, in that what party elites or the president is saying dictates what you think, you know, what your moral compass is, which one would think is exactly backwards.
There's a question for Joanne about, from Peg Carter, who wants to know why the media has given coverage to every tweet that Donald Trump puts out, and whether that's adding fuel to an already simmering fire. Have we covered Donald Trump too much?
Okay, so I'll answer that question, but no, it's my opinion, not a news organization. Look, there's always been a tradition in our society that you cover the president, and when the president speaks, you cover it. And I think that this is something that news organizations to this minute are wrestling with. I do think that, believe it or not, every tweet is not covered these days, but a lot of it is. And, you know, I think that it depends how it's covered, right? Not all things are equal. If a news organization is just saying the president said this without any context, any background, I think journalists do try and do that. But, you know, he has definitely, in a metaphorical and real way, stolen the microphone, controlled the narrative for 4 years. So do I think that the press should not cover every single tweet? Absolutely. I think it should be more discerning.
Thank you. Peter Katz is from Boston is asking, 538 recently published a piece headline, How Hatred Came to Dominate American Politics. If Joe Biden is elected, what concrete steps could he take to dial this trend back? And conversely, if President Trump is reelected, how much worse might things get? So why don't we go to Shanto for that one?
Well, I think Mr. Biden has made it pretty clear that he is interested in dialing down the rhetoric. And I think these things tend to go in cycles. So you have a period of intense conflict and acrimony, followed by a period in which perhaps there's some dialing down of the rhetoric. We noticed, you know, post Watergate, you got Gerald Ford, who was, completely sort of, I wouldn't want to say nonpartisan, but he was certainly not as controversial, as vigorous in his partisan demeanor as his predecessor. So it's possible that if Mr. Biden gets in, we might see some depolarization, at least in terms of the rhetoric that's coming out of Washington. If Mr. Trump is reelected, on the other hand, I would anticipate more of the same.
And finally, let's go to Chris, who's watching on YouTube, who asks whether or not the panelists think that a decisive Biden win and a Democratic takeover of the Senate this November will help reduce polarization. Will Republicans potentially see that as see those divisive racial tactics backfire and do more to work with the Democrats?
From what I know of Washington, I think that answer has different layers. I think that Donald Trump, and some of the forces around him did not create this division, but actually sort of opened Pandora's box to unleash a lot of what was there and tamp down. If Biden wins, it's a Senate win for the Democrats, and the House stays Democratic. I think that some of the rhetoric in Washington will tamp down, but I don't necessarily think that some of the sort of the polarization forces out there outside of the Beltway will necessarily stay quiet. I just don't see that happening.
Yip, did you want to weigh in on that one as well?
Yeah, I don't. It is true that if Biden is more congenial or more polite, it will tone things down a bit. But as long as there's kind of electoral incentive to be extreme, I think we're going to continue seeing extremity on certain things. So I'm not sure until there's one possibility, and we're shifting that way, is until kind of this coalition of the rich and the white working class is no longer a viable electoral coalition, we will continue seeing kind of rhetoric that taps into kind of these racially extreme statements.
Great, thank you. We're just about out of time for tonight, so I want to thank everyone for attending another GBH News Forum and for staying with us through technical difficulties. I guess I am an analog girl living in a digital world, so I apologize for the problems with my audio this evening. Thank you to our distinguished panelists for being here this evening. Yesh Lelkish, Joanne Levine, and Shanto Iyengar for sharing your knowledge and perspective with us. We hope you'll join us again next year for a new season of GBH News Forums. In the meantime, visit wgbh.org/events for upcoming virtual event opportunities in the weeks ahead. As Jamie Reese, my colleague in the Member Engagement Department, mentioned, your ongoing support is what allows us to bring objective, fact-based local journalism to audiences across radio, television, and digital. I encourage you to contribute what you can by visiting wgbh.org/support events. We also want to make sure that even when these events end, we leave you with the tools and resources to continue learning about this topic. Today, we've partnered with Brookline Booksmith to curate a virtual book table on titles related to the divisions in our country and how we can better understand the differences. Alex Schaffner, Events Director at Brookline Booksmith, is here to tell you more about this book list.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you to all the panelists. This was a really fantastic and fascinating conversation. Brookline Booksmith and GBH have a long-standing relationship. I'm really pleased that we could be part of that with this conversation tonight. This is a conversation that we hope to be part of with our community every day. So with this list, we've created something that we hope addresses the question of this talk in a couple of ways. First, we want to address the kinds of powerlessness that are capitalized on and enforced by the powerful in an increasingly divided climate. Marginalization over many kinds of demographics is complicated and overlapping, but it often crystallizes into simplified and oppositional talking points in national conversation. And of course, it's not simple at all. So this highlights some of the many margins Americans live within, the ways that they're both overlapping and distinct, and also our selections show in their absence, I think, the people in power who are comfortable with these many groups' ongoing and often deliberately inflicted discomfort. The other portion of the list grapples with essentially the estrangement of ethics and compassion from our mainstream political and social structures, and proclaims the necessity of centering ethical and compassionate action as opposed to partisanship if a stable and equitable society is to be built and retained in this country. The list has been curated as a starting point by our bookselling staff. They certainly are not an exhaustive checklist of American experiences, but they are all outstanding books that we hope will, taken either separately or all together, encourage a deeper and more expansive understanding of the people around us. So thank you so much for letting us be part of this. We hope that you all find some or all of these books helpful and edifying.
Thank you, Alex. And thanks again to everyone who joined us. After you exit the webinar, you'll be taken to a page with a survey that will pop up on your screen. We would really appreciate it if you take the time to give us your feedback so we can make these events even better in the future. Thanks again for being with us tonight. Have a good evening.